They called it a wedding. It was a funeral with better silk, a cursed bride, sent north as tribute, a king they said fed on the screams of prisoners, a debt paid in flesh because gold alone couldn't buy peace anymore. The Valley Lords smiled like men who'd finally won something. Coins changed hands before the ink was dry on the treaty. Her uncle didn't even wait for the carriage to leave before he started spending it. They didn't know she'd already lived this morning once before, in a dream 3 weeks old that still made her hands shake. They didn't know that in every version she'd seen since, someone in that courtyard ended up dead. And it was never her. She wasn't being sent north to die. She was being sent north to watch. For the first time in her life, someone else's death arrive on schedule. The carriage climbed for 5 days through snow that refused to stop falling, the wheels groaning against ice, her breath fogging the frosted glass. The soldiers escorting her wouldn't hold her eyes for more than a second. They'd drawn the short straw for this posting, and it showed in the white-knuckled grip on their reins. We reach the pass by nightfall, and if we don't, no one answered that. Before we continue, please hit the subscribe and like button and tell me which city you're tuning in from. I love to know where this story found you. Now let's dive in. Bianca hadn't spoken since the morning her uncle signed the parchment that sold her. She didn't need to. She already knew every word that was coming. Not because anyone had told her, but because she'd seen it. The North had gone quiet since King Ronan Blackmore bound the mountain clans under one crown. But quiet had never once meant peace. Peace, this time, cost a bride. Her uncle had 3 daughters of his own. He hadn't offered a single one. He'd offered the niece the family had spent 16 years calling cursed, forgotten, sold. She'd worn all 3 names since she was 7 years old, and only one of them had ever been true, though it wasn't the one they thought. For 23 years, that truth had followed her through every locked room in House Voss, waiting for someone to finally ask the right question. She could see pieces of the future, never on command. The visions came when they wanted, in sleep, through touch, sometimes just by holding someone's gaze a breath too long. At 7, she'd watched a barn burn in a dream and woken up screaming 2 hours before it actually caught fire. 20 horses died that night. At 12, she'd begged her father not to sail the eastern lake. He'd kissed her forehead and gone anyway. 3 days later, the ship never came home, and the house stopped calling her blessed. They called her cursed instead. When a plague she'd warned them about, a month too early for anyone to believe her, took both her parents. Her uncle Garrick inherited House Voss, and Bianca inherited a locked door in the watchtower above the Black Pines. He only let her out when merchants needed to know which roads were safe, which shipments would survive the season, which rivals were worth ruining. Every fortune Garrick built carried her fingerprints. Not one coin of it was ever hers. So when the Wolf King demanded a noble bride to seal his treaty, Garrick didn't hesitate. Why spend a daughter he loved when he had a niece nobody wanted? By the 4th evening of the journey, the escort had mostly stopped speaking to her, until she sat bolt upright and told the captain to stop the caravan. "We're almost at the pass," he said. "Stop now. We lose the light if the mountain is going to fall." Someone laughed. Then the horses went rigid, ears flat, and a crack split the air like the sky had broken open. Seconds later, half the mountain came down where the road should have been, burying the shortcut under 1,000 tons of snow and stone. Nobody laughed again. For the rest of the ride, the men gave her more room than the carriage allowed. Frostfang Keep rose out of the peaks like it had been carved from the ice itself. Black banners, grey stone, and along the battlements, wolves standing sentry like they'd been posted there on purpose. The gates were still grinding open when the first arrow came from the tree line. It missed Bianca by a hand's width and buried itself in the carriage door. The guards scattered. Someone shouted a name, and before she'd decided to move, she was already moving, dropping from the carriage, tearing a hunting knife from a fallen soldier's belt, and driving it into the throat of the man who lunged for her a heartbeat later. She hadn't seen that one coming. That was almost worse than the vision. She was still standing over him, blade dripping, chains rattling at her wrists, when the courtyard went utterly silent. King Ronan Blackmore stood at the open gate, flanked by wolves the size of horses and warriors, who hadn't so much as reached for their swords. He looked exactly like the stories, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, a sword across his back, a wolf fur cloak, dusted with snow. But his eyes weren't on the dead man at her feet. They were on the shackles. Who chained her? No one answered. He crossed the courtyard himself, knelt, and broke the irons off her wrists with his bare hands. Then he unclasped his own cloak and settled it over her shoulders. "You'll freeze," he said, "before you finish killing everyone who deserves it." The wedding took 4 minutes. No feast, no crowd, just old vows spoken beneath the moon shrine, while snow drifted through a broken seam in the roof, and a king, who married a stranger, like he had exactly 4 minutes to spare for his own wedding. Bianca expected to be led to a gilded room and forgotten, the way royal brides always were, in the stories Garrick used to tell. Instead, Ronan took her straight to the war room. Maps covered every wall. Messengers argued over grain counts. In the corner, children from a burned border village slept in a pile of borrowed cloaks, while soldiers quietly split their own rations to feed them. There was no luxury in Frostfang Keep, only work, and a king who looked far more tired than terrifying. Everything she'd been told about the Wolf King was starting to come apart in her hands. That night, the visions came without asking permission, stronger than they'd ever come before. She stood alone, in a forest that wasn't a forest, snow falling upward through silver light, and a wolf the size of a house stepped out of the mist, eyes burning like twin moons. It didn't move its mouth. It didn't need to. The traitor already walks beside the throne. The mist tore open. She saw Ronan seated on his own throne, a smiling servant offering him wine. She saw him drink. She saw the blood come after. Bianca woke gasping, and across the dark room, Ronan was already sitting up, already watching her. "You saw something," he said. It wasn't a question. She didn't answer him. She couldn't. The vision hadn't finished with her yet. It dragged her back down before she could speak. The same silver mist, but wider now, hungrier. She saw Frostfang's black banners catch fire one by one along the wall. She saw Ronan's crown split down the center and fall into snow gone red at the edges. She saw the full moon over the keep bleed from white to the color of a fresh wound, and stay that color. Then it let her go. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking, even with her eyes open again. "Castle burning," she said hoarsely. "Your crown broken, the moon turning red over all of it. And you." She stopped. "Dead," Ronan finished for her. He didn't flinch saying it. "I don't know when. I never know when." He was quiet a long moment. Then, "My grandmother had the moon sight. Before you, she was the last one anyone spoke of, and that was 2 generations ago." His jaw tightened. She used to get that exact look on her face, right before she said something no one wanted to hear. What happened to her? His expression closed like a shutter. "She's the reason I don't trust courtiers who smile too easily." He didn't explain further, and something in his face told her not to ask twice. Not tonight. "You believe me, though. I buried her not believing her fast enough. I won't make that mistake twice." He held her gaze. "You won't have that problem here. Not with me." He didn't say the rest, that no one else in Frostfang would extend her the same courtesy. She learned that within the hour. Morning brought her face to face with the keep she'd married into. The captain from the mountain road, the one who'd stopped laughing after the avalanche, fell into step beside her, without being asked, hand near his sword, saying nothing. That was loyalty, she was starting to learn, spoken here in silence rather than words. The steward was a different creature entirely. He bowed low enough to satisfy protocol and not a hair lower, informing her, sweetly, unnecessarily, that the king's morning meal was usually a private affair. Ronan overruled him without looking up from his maps. In the hall, the council watched her, the way men watch weather that might ruin their harvest. Lord Hesk, the eldest of them, murmured something behind his hand that made 2 others laugh quietly into their sleeves. One noblewoman, dressed for a court that no longer feasted, looked her over once, chains gone, cloak too fine for a bastard-blooded bride, and said, just loud enough to be heard, "How convenient. Marrying a girl who can see exactly what her husband wants to hear. General Kalen didn't bow at all. A seer, he said, like the word itself tasted wrong. Convenient, that she predicts exactly what keeps her close to the throne. The king's advisor, thin and soft-spoken, only smiled. No one doubts your gift, my lady. Some of us simply wonder who taught you to use it. Ronan said nothing to either of them. He didn't have to. Everyone in the room understood exactly whose side he'd already chosen. Breakfast was already laid when the numbness hit. It started in Bianca's fingers and climbed fast, the hall dissolving around her the way it always did, one heartbeat stolen out of time. She saw an elderly servant smiling as he set down a silver goblet. She saw Ronan lift it. She saw it fall, and the wine beneath it eating through solid stone, like acid through paper. She was on her feet before the vision fully cleared. "Don't drink it!" Ronan didn't ask why. He never did anymore. He simply struck the goblet from the old servant's hands. It shattered against the flagstones. The wine hissed where it landed, and smoke curled up from a scar it burned straight into the rock. The hall erupted. Guards seized the servant before he'd taken 2 steps, and he bit down on something hidden in his cheek before anyone could drag a single word out of him. He was dead before he hit the floor. Silence swallowed the room. Every face turned toward Bianca. Not with fear this time, with something closer to belief. Ronan found her hand under the table before the guards had even finished dragging the body out. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. His thumb pressed once against her knuckles, steady, and it did more to stop her shaking than anything since she'd left House Voss. The castle physician confirmed it by midday. The poison wasn't anything grown in the valley, or bought from any trader who'd passed through Frostfang's gates in a year. It was ashroot, a toxin found only high in the northern peaks, in caves no outsider could reach without a guide who knew the mountain by memory. Someone inside Frostfang had gone up for it, carried it back down, placed it in the king's own hall. Kalen's suspicion hadn't moved an inch. If anything, saving Ronan had only sharpened it. The advisor's smile hadn't slipped once. Ronan stood at the window a long while that evening, watching mountains he'd known his whole life like he was seeing a stranger's face in them. "My scouts keep disappearing," he said quietly. "My stores keep turning up poisoned. My council calls it bad luck." He turned to Bianca. "I stopped believing in luck the moment you walked through my gates." Somewhere in Frostfang Keep, someone was still smiling. No one found the traitor. Not that week, not the next. Frostfang searched anyway. Every servant questioned, every storeroom overturned, and came up with nothing but suspicion, thick enough to choke on. Bianca felt it every time she crossed the courtyard. Eyes that flicked to her first, before they flicked to anyone else. The wolves were worse than the court, in their own way. At least the court hid behind manners. One warrior spat near her boots, and called her a plague wearing a crown. An old she-wolf refused to share a fire with her, muttering that cursed blood-curdled milk and soured meat. Someone started calling her a name in the old tongue that no one would translate. She decided she didn't want to know badly enough to ask twice. Only the children didn't seem to care what she was. They trailed her through the halls in a ragged little pack of their own, demanding to know if she could see what they'd get for their name day, whether the goat pens would flood, if the tall boy from the kitchens would ever stop tripping over his own feet. "I can't see everything," she told them, the 3rd or 4th time someone asked. "But you saved the king," said the smallest one, like that settled the matter completely. She never had real answers for any of them. She gave them her attention instead, and that turned out to matter more than any vision could. Then the visions started finding uses smaller than kings and poison. She grabbed a boy by the collar 3 heartbeats, before a barn roof caved in under new snow, and didn't let go until the groaning timber finished falling exactly where he'd have been standing. She warned a fisherman off the river the morning before the ice broke, and swallowed the spot he always cast his line. She woke from a doze by the hearth, certain a child had wandered toward wolf territory, and found the girl exactly where she knew to look, unhurt and unaware how close she'd come to something with teeth. Word travels faster inside a keep than anywhere else in the world. By the time the girl was carried back through the gates safe, half of Frostfang had already heard 3 different versions of how. Nobody called Bianca cursed after that. Not out loud, anyway. Ronan noticed something else. Something she hadn't meant to show him. That she always moved to save someone before she thought to save herself. He mentioned it once, quietly, like he wasn't sure he was allowed to. She didn't have an answer for that either. He took her to the library instead, a room hidden behind the war room, shelves of frost-warped books no one else seemed to remember existed, dust and old parchment, and one small window looking out over the black pines. "My grandmother's," he said. "No one comes here anymore." They talked about destiny until the candle burned low. Ronan believed fate was a wall, fixed, unmovable, something a man either broke himself against or learned to live inside. He'd built his whole reign on that belief, he admitted. Easier to carry a crown you couldn't escape than one you'd chosen and might still fail. Bianca wasn't so sure fate worked that way anymore. "Not every vision comes true," she admitted. "I used to think they did. But some futures change the moment someone decides not to let them happen." She thought of the avalanche, of the goblet on the floor. Maybe that's the entire point of seeing them at all. Ronan looked at her, like that idea had never once occurred to him, and like he wanted, badly, for it to be true. The scout came back through the gates 3 days later, bleeding from a wound no one could explain, and half frozen from a fall he shouldn't have survived. Bianca helped hold the wound closed herself while the healers worked, her hands red to the wrist, until his breathing steadied enough for the fever to take his mind, instead of his life. They got one sentence out of him before it did. "Beyond the ridgeline, there's more of them than we counted." His armor told the rest of the story. Burned into the shoulder plate, scorched deep enough to blacken the metal, was a mark like a broken circle split by 3 claws. Bianca had seen that exact mark before. Not on armor. In a vision, 3 nights ago, burned into a battle standard she hadn't yet understood. By morning, Ronan had his generals mapping every trail through the eastern passes. "Whoever they are," he said, "they've been gathering long enough to move in numbers. This wasn't scouts stumbling on each other by accident." Bianca stared at the crude mark redrawn on the map table, a cold settling under her ribs that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Someone was building an army in the dead ground beyond Frostfang's walls, and whatever it was gathering for, her visions were only just beginning to show her its shape. They left for the border 3 days later, once the wounded scout's fever broke enough for him to sketch a rough map with a shaking hand. 6 villages along the eastern edge of Ronan's territory had gone silent within the same week. No messages, no smoke, nothing. Ronan brought 12 riders and refused to leave Bianca behind. Not because he doubted her, he said, but because he'd stopped trusting anything he couldn't see with his own eyes. They rode 2 days through country too quiet for comfort. At night, when the others slept, Ronan sat close enough that their shoulders touched and didn't move away, and neither did she. "You don't have to come to every one of these," he said once, low, watching the fire instead of her. "Neither do you." He didn't argue with that. Neither of them mentioned it again, but he didn't move his shoulder away either. The first village looked like its people had simply stepped outside and never come back. Bread left half-kneaded on a table, a child's shoe by an open door. No blood, no struggle, no bodies at all. Whatever had come through here had wanted them alive. Bianca laid her palm against the doorframe of the nearest home, and the world dissolved into someone else's last few seconds. Torches in the dark, shapes moving too fast to name, a woman screaming a child's name before the vision cut to black, like something had reached in and severed it on purpose. "Wolves," one of the riders muttered, crouching over a set of prints pressed deep into the frozen mud. "Big ones." Ronan crouched beside him and went very still. "These aren't running prints," he said. "They're dragging prints. Something was pulled through here, not chased." They found the truth 2 villages later. In a root cellar someone had tried to seal with fresh-cut timber. Not wolves. Not attacking anyway. The hearth in the nearest home was still faintly warm. Whoever came for these children hadn't needed the cover of a cold trail. Every missing villager they could account for was a child, and not human children. Wolf-born pups, some barely old enough to shift, taken from every home while the adults were lured off or overpowered first. The tracks weren't from a raiding pack. They were from terrified young wolves being dragged toward wagons that didn't belong to anyone Ronan recognized. 3 pups had escaped the cellar and hidden in the dark for 2 days, too frightened to shift back, too young to understand why. They wouldn't come out for the soldiers. They came out for Bianca. She sat in the snow until her legs went numb, murmuring nothing in particular, and let 3 shaking, half-grown wolves press against her until they trusted their own skin enough to become children again. One of the riders who'd insulted her in the courtyard 3 weeks earlier carried a sleeping pup back to camp himself, and didn't meet her eyes when he did it. The wagon tracks were still fresh enough to follow, and Ronan didn't wait for morning. They rode the trail hard through the dark, and caught the convoy trying to ford a half-frozen stream, 2 valleys south, 3 wagons, a dozen guards who scattered the moment wolves the size of horses came out of the tree line. Most vanished into the rocks. One driver's horse threw him into the shallows, and Ronan had a blade at his throat before the man finished coughing up water. He talked fast, the way men do when a king's wolves are close enough to smell. He didn't know who was paying him, only that the coin came through a broker in the southern valley, that the orders arrived sealed and unsigned, and that the man behind it all had enough gold to make an entire company forget how to ask questions. Southern Valley, Ronan repeated, looking at Bianca. She thought of her uncle's vaults, filling the same week he sold her north. She didn't say his name. She didn't have to. It sat in the space between them anyway, unconfirmed and impossible to ignore. That night, the vision came harder than any before it. She stood over Ronan's body in the snow, his blood already going dark at the edges. The mark from the scout's armor burned into the sky above them like a second, crueler moon. She looked down to see what had killed him. Her own hand was on the hilt. Bianca woke with a scream she barely swallowed in time, and did not sleep again before dawn. A warning could be stopped. A fate couldn't. Not by anything Bianca had ever managed to change. Not really. She'd spent 3 days turning that difference over in her mind, since the vision of her own hand on the hilt, and she still didn't have an answer she could live with. She needed to understand what the visions actually were, not guess, know. So when a servant mentioned, in passing, that Frostfang had cellars older than the keep itself, older than anyone currently living, Bianca went looking for a door. She found it behind a shelf in the library Ronan had shown her, a seam in the stone too straight to be natural. The passage beyond dropped deep under the mountain, air going colder and older with every step, until it opened into a round chamber, lit only by a shaft of moonlight falling through some hidden gap far above. An altar stood at the center, carved with the same crescent symbol as the moon shrine upstairs. Except here, the carvings continued across every wall, spiraling outward into names. Dozens of them, each one followed by a single word. Bianca traced her fingers along the closest name and felt her stomach drop. Vanished. The next one. Vanished. The one after. Lost to the mountain. Not one of them read, died of age, or died in her bed, or anything close to natural. She counted 11 names before she stopped counting, going back, by the style of the carving alone, at least 300 years. The most recent name was carved less carefully than the rest, like whoever cut it had been grieving too hard to be careful. Bianca recognized it before she'd even finished reading. Ronan's grandmother. Beside it, a single word. Murdered. Every moonseer the North had ever known had disappeared or died wrong, not faded from memory. Hunted, one by one, until the gift stopped appearing at all. For 2 full generations. Until her. Whatever wanted her dead hadn't started with the goblet of poison. It hadn't started with the man at the gates, or the mercenaries in the border villages. It had been waiting for over 300 years. She was still shaking when Ronan found her in the library that night, and for once, she didn't try to soften what she'd learned before she said it. Your grandmother wasn't lost to a fever, she said. She was murdered, like all of them. Something in his face went very still, and very old. I know, he said quietly. I've always known. No one else ever believed me either. He sat close enough that his shoulder found hers again, without either of them deciding it should. I used to hide in those same tunnels, he admitted, after my parents died of the fever that took her, in the same season. I was 12, too young to be king of anything, and too proud to let the generals watching me see me cry over a crown I never asked for. You never broke. I just stopped letting anyone close enough to find out if I could. Until now? Until a woman climbed out of my own cellars, covered in 300 years of dust, and told me the truth I've been carrying alone since I was 12. The corner of his mouth almost moved. Hard to keep my distance from that. She didn't remember deciding to lean toward him. She only remembered his hand finding her jaw. Gentle, like she was something that might still choose to run. A fist hammered against the door. My king. A rider's come through. It's urgent. Ronan closed his eyes for one long breath before he stood. The letter waiting in the war room bore no royal seal. Just plain wax. Pressed with a signet, Bianca recognized instantly, because she'd watched it stamp 100 trade agreements built on her stolen visions. House Voss. Garrick's handwriting was as elegant as ever, each word a blade wearing silk. I know she lived. I know what she is now. A pity you didn't ask my price before you married my mistake. You'll be hearing from me again, before the next moon is full. Ronan set the letter down without a word, but Bianca saw the fire finally reach his eyes. Her uncle wasn't guessing anymore. He knew. Frostfang went cold in a different way after the letter. Ronan sealed the gates within the hour. No one in, no one out. Every guard doubled. Every servant's movements tracked by someone who didn't trust them anymore. It didn't take long for the fear to turn on itself. A kitchen boy was dragged before Kaelin for owning a knife too fine for his station. A washerwoman was accused because she'd once served in a southern household, years before anyone in Frostfang had heard of House Voss. 2 guards who'd shared a watch for a decade stopped speaking to each other entirely. Even Bianca wasn't spared. Kaelin watched her cross the courtyard with the same flat suspicion he'd worn the morning they met. Poison or no poison, dagger or no dagger. Trust didn't survive a lockdown. It just went looking for somewhere else to point, and it kept circling back to her. The council convened at midday regardless. Ronan refused to let fear cancel a single meeting, refused to let whoever sent that letter believe it had worked. The talk was almost mundane. Grain counts, a bridge needing repair, Lord Hesk complaining about rationed wine. For a few minutes, it almost felt like an ordinary kingdom again. Then the numbness hit Bianca's fingers so hard she nearly dropped her cup. She saw the blade before she saw the hand holding it. Behind you, she was already moving, catching the wrist of the council scribe lunging across the table, a half-second before the dagger found Ronan's throat, instead of the air beside it. The blade opened her palm instead. Guards swarmed the man before he could try again, and Ronan hauled her back by the shoulders, like he could physically put himself between her and every knife in the room at once. "You're bleeding," he said, voice tight. "You're alive," she said. "We'll call it even." The scribe broke fast under questioning, faster than the servant with the poison ever had, because this time Ronan didn't leave the room. He hadn't acted alone. He'd been paid, positioned, and given his exact moment by someone inside the council itself. Who? Ronan's voice was ice. The scribe's eyes went, involuntarily, to the empty chair at the end of the table. Chancellor Voren's chair. The thin, soft-spoken man who'd questioned Bianca's gift from her very first morning in these halls, who'd sat through every council meeting since, nodding, agreeing, watching, was already gone. They broke down his chamber door to find it stripped nearly bare, drawers hanging open, the fire in the hearth still faintly warm from whatever he'd burned before he left. One drawer held nothing but a folded scrap of parchment. On it, in a hand Bianca now recognized instantly, 3 words: "Time to leave," signed with her uncle's seal. Voren had known these tunnels as long as he'd known the man he truly served, and Bianca knew, with a certainty that had nothing to do with visions, exactly where he'd gone before he ran. The underground shrine. The altar stood exactly as she'd left it, except the small crescent-carved stone that had rested at its center for 300 years was gone. She pressed her palm flat against the empty groove anyway, foolishly, as if it might still answer her. Something in her chest went strangely, frighteningly quiet instead, like a voice she'd always half heard had simply stopped mid-sentence. She tried anyway, that evening, reaching for the smallest vision she could think of. Tomorrow's weather, nothing more. What came back was fragments, scattered and wrong, shapes that dissolved before she could name them, like trying to read a book with half its pages torn out. "I can't see clearly anymore," she told Ronan, and hated how much the admission cost her. Whatever that stone did, I needed it more than I understood. The horn sounded an hour past midnight. Not the pattern for fire, or wolves, or any drill Frostfang's guards had ever practiced. The pattern for enemies already inside the walls. Bianca reached the battlements in time to see the eastern gate standing wide open. No siege engine, no breach, just open, like someone had walked up and unlocked it from the outside, with a key he'd carried out of the castle himself. Beyond it, torches were moving down out of the mountains, in numbers she couldn't begin to count, arranged in the disciplined lines of an army that had been waiting a long time for exactly this door to open. Ronan was already shouting orders before she'd finished understanding what she was looking at. Voran hadn't run to hide. He'd run to let them in. The storm hit before the enemy did, snow turning sideways in winds that swallowed torchlight whole. Frostfang's warriors poured onto the walls anyway, wolves in their true shape crashing into the first wave through the open gate. Villagers behind them, with spears and kitchen knives, and whatever else could be sharpened in an hour. Even the kitchen boy Kalen had dragged in for questioning 3 days earlier, stood on the wall now, hurling stones down into the dark with everyone else. Siege towers Bianca hadn't even seen built came grinding out of the storm, already burning at the base from Ronan's archers, collapsing into the snow one by one in showers of sparks that hissed and died against the white. The line held, barely. Everywhere she looked, someone was screaming a name, or a warning, or both, and the captain who'd once ridden silent beside her on the mountain road fought 2 men off a ladder without wasting breath on a single sound. Without the relic, the visions came broken, half a scene, a sound without a picture, a feeling with no shape. But broken was still something. She caught a flash of a ladder crew rounding the eastern wall a full 10 seconds before they appeared, and Ronan redirected 6 wolves to meet them. She felt, more than saw, a collapse coming in the south tower, and screamed the order to clear it, seconds before the whole structure buckled into the courtyard. When Kalen went down under 2 men at once, she didn't need a vision at all. Just a warning shout sharp enough to bring 3 wolves crashing into the fight, before the general could bleed out in the snow. He didn't thank her. He didn't have to. The look he gave her afterward said enough. Each vision cost her more than the last. A line of fire behind her eyes, blood at the edge of one nostril she didn't have time to wipe away. She kept reaching anyway. Frostfang was still standing, because she kept reaching anyway. She didn't see the spear coming. Not soon enough. She felt Ronan's weight slam into her first, shoving her sideways into the snow a half-breath, before the point that should have gone through her throat buried itself instead in his side, just beneath the ribs. He went down hard. Ronan. Blood was already dark against the snow, spreading faster than it should have. His eyes found hers anyway. Glassy but stubborn, like even dying he refused to look anywhere else. She didn't think. She pressed both hands over the wound and reached, not for the future this time, but for whatever was left of the visions, to guide her hands instead of her eyes, the way she'd once seen a healer work, in a memory that wasn't fully hers. Blood slowed. Not stopped. Slowed. Enough. Enough to get him breathing steady. Enough to buy the healers time to do the rest once the worst of the wave broke. Foolish, she told him, hands still shaking, still pressed to his side. You could have let the spear miss me and stayed out of the way. Never learned how, he managed, voice thin. Never wanted to either. I don't want to lose you, she said, and it came out before she could soften it into something safer. I've seen you die a dozen times since I came here. I'm not ready to watch it happen for real. He almost smiled, even bleeding in the snow. Then don't let it. He came through the broken gate on foot, flanked by mercenaries who kept a careful distance from him, like even they weren't fully certain what he'd become capable of. Her uncle looked older than she remembered, smaller somehow, despite everything he'd built to destroy her. You were never supposed to survive the winter, Garrick said, almost gently, as if that made it kinder. I didn't sell you because I hated you, Bianca. I sold you because I was afraid of you. Afraid of what you saw every time you looked at me. Every ledger I falsified. Every rival I ruined. You knew all of it. And one day you would have said so out loud. So you tried to have me killed instead. I tried to make you someone else's problem. His eyes flicked to Ronan, bleeding in her arms. She's not a problem, Ronan said, voice raw but carrying. She's the reason your army is retreating, instead of standing over my body right now. It appears, Garrick allowed. I only made you more dangerous. The horn for retreat sounded from somewhere behind the mercenary lines, before Garrick could say anything else. Voran's doing, she'd learn later, some calculation about numbers that hadn't gone his way. The enemy pulled back into the storm as fast as they'd come, dragging their wounded, leaving their dead. Garrick went with them, and this time no one stopped him in time. By dawn, the snow had turned red in a dozen places, and Frostfang's gates were still standing, scorched, dented, barely holding on their hinges, but standing. Ronan was alive, propped against a wall with Bianca's cloak wrapped tight around his wound, and refusing every healer who tried to make him lie down. Kaelan found her in the wreckage of the courtyard, and, for the first time since she'd arrived, said her name instead of her title. They had survived. Barely was still a word she intended to hold on to with both hands. 3 days after the siege, Frostfang finally stopped bleeding. Ronan's wound closed under the healer's care, slow and stubborn like everything else about him. The dead were buried in ground too frozen to dig properly, so the pack burned them instead, and Bianca stood through every single fire because it felt wrong not to. In the nursery wing, the 3 pups she'd once sat with in the snow were sleeping soundly for the first time in weeks, safe behind walls that had held. She watched them a long while through the doorway before she let herself feel anything close to peace. She hadn't reached for a vision since the battle. She was afraid, for the first time, of what answering that pull might finally cost her. It came anyway, 3 nights later, without her reaching for it at all. This vision didn't fracture like the others had since the relic was stolen. It arrived whole, the way visions used to before any of this began. Frostfang standing under an ordinary grey sky. Ronan alive, older, laughing at something she couldn't hear. Children who weren't yet born playing in a courtyard that had once been a battlefield. And at the center of all of it, herself. Older too, closing her eyes on the moon sight forever, by choice, and never opening them on a single vision again. She watched herself let go, in that vision, and felt no fear in it at all. Only relief, vast and quiet, like setting down something she'd been carrying since she was 7 years old. One future, only one. Every broken fragment she'd fought through since the siege had been leading here, to this single, unbearable clarity. The only way through Garrick was to walk in with nothing left to lose, not even the gift that had defined her entire life. She sat with that truth long after the vision released her, turning it over like a stone she couldn't put down. She tried to remember who she'd been before the vision started, and found almost nothing there. A child who liked horses, maybe. A girl who used to laugh before the barn fire. Everything after that, every year, every room, every name they'd called her, cursed and blessed and seer and weapon, had the moon sight woven through it so completely she couldn't find the seam where it started. The forgotten daughter, the cursed niece, the seer nobody wanted, until suddenly everyone did. Without it, who was left? She didn't have an answer. That frightened her more than Garrick, more than the army, more than any vision of anyone dying had ever managed to. She found Ronan on the battlements, still favoring his healing side, watching the mountains, like he expected them to answer for what they'd cost him. I might lose it, she told him. No preamble. The sight. To end this, I might have to give it up completely. He turned, and there was no hesitation in his face at all. I don't need a prophet, he said. I never did. I need you. The woman who held a wound closed with her bare hands because she refused to lose someone, not the visions that told her when to do it. You married a seer. I married Bianca. His hand found her jaw, the way it almost had once before, and this time, no one hammered on a door to stop him. The rest was never the part I wanted. She kissed him first, or maybe he did. Neither of them argued about it afterward. It wasn't gentle, and it wasn't careful, and it answered a question she hadn't managed to ask out loud in 8 chapters of nearly losing him. By the next morning, Word had already spread through every hall in Frostfang. The wolves who'd once spat at her boots knelt when she crossed the courtyard. Kalen was the first. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. Bianca Voss, Seer, survivor, soon to be queen in more than name, had finally stopped being someone the pack merely tolerated. The message came before the celebration had even finished. A rider, half frozen, carrying a small wooden token Bianca recognized instantly. The same rough carving the rescued pups had given her as thanks. 6 more children were missing from the border villages by morning. Not stolen quietly. Announced, deliberately, so there could be no mistaking whose hand had taken them. Garrick's message was short. Come to House Voss. Come alone, and bring what's left of your gift, or don't bother coming at all. Ronan's jaw tightened as he read it over her shoulder. We go together, he said. Whatever's left of your gift, and whatever's left of mine. Bianca thought of the vision. One future. One choice. She was finally ready to make it. The ride to House Voss took 2 days through territory Bianca hadn't seen since the carriage first carried her north in chains. Snow gave way to bare hills, then to the valley itself, grey and unchanged, like it had been waiting for her to come back and finish something. Garrick received them in the same hall where he'd sold her. 6 children chained along the far wall, the stolen moon relic sitting on a table between them like a trophy. Every prophecy you ever had led exactly here, he said, almost fond. I read the old records too, niece. I know what happens to seers who refuse their fate. It kills them slower than a blade ever could. You think I came to refuse it. I think you came because you couldn't help it. That's what the visions do. They drag you toward the ending, whether you want it or not. Something in her chest went very still. Not the old pull of a vision arriving, but something new. Something that felt more like waking up than seeing. He was wrong. He'd always been wrong, and so had she. Moonseers didn't simply witness fate, they rewrote it. Every vision she'd ever had, every warning, every glimpse of blood on snow, hadn't been a sentence handed down. It had been a door held open, over and over, for someone to choose differently. She had always chosen differently. That was the gift. Not the sight, the choosing. She'd seen this exact room 100 times in fractured pieces since the relic was stolen. Herself, defeated. The sight gone dark. Garrick, standing over everyone she loved. She rejected it. Not with a vision, with a choice. She crossed the hall before the guards could stop her, closed both hands around the crescent stone, and brought it down against the stone floor with everything 300 years of hunted women had never gotten the chance to use. It didn't shatter like glass. It simply stopped. The hum she'd never fully noticed until it was gone. Silent at last. And so was the voice she'd carried in her head since she was 7 years old. Garrick's mercenaries didn't wait to see what came next. Whatever he'd promised them had clearly never included watching a woman deliberately burn out the only weapon he'd built his entire plan around. They ran the moment the relic broke, leaving him alone in a hall full of Frostfang wolves and a niece he could no longer read. He didn't run fast enough. His own men made sure of that, cutting him down in the courtyard before Ronan's wolves ever reached him. The same betrayal he'd built his fortune on finally turned back on him. Ronan lived. The children went free. Frostfang stood, and somewhere in the wreckage of House Voss, 2 kingdoms that had feared each other for 3 generations finally had a reason to stop. Months later, the peace treaty succeeded, where 100 years of raids and tribute never had. Valley grain fed northern winters. Northern furs warmed valley homes. The road between them, once traveled only by soldiers and sacrificial brides, filled instead with merchants who no longer needed an armed escort. Bianca never saw another vision. She'd braced for grief and found, instead, something closer to peace. Mornings that surprised her, decisions that were only guesses, a future as unknown to her as it was to everyone else. For the first time in 23 years, Ronan placed the crown on her head in the spring, in front of both kingdoms, and made a point of saying, in front of everyone, that he crowned her not because she'd ever seen the future, but because she'd spent a year earning the right to help build one. That night, Bianca stood on Frostfang's walls, under a full moon for the first time, without flinching from what it might show her. It showed her nothing at all. just snow and stars and a kingdom finally quiet enough to sleep. She thought of the girl in chains who used to see every ending before it arrived, and understood, at last, why the visions had always cost her so much. Some part of her had always known that seeing the future and living it were never the same thing. Ronan found her hand without a word. Below them, their people were still celebrating, voices rising warm against the cold. Bianca smiled at a future she couldn't see coming. For the first time in her life, that didn't feel like losing something. It felt like getting to choose. If you enjoyed the story, let me know in the comments. Your voice decides what I write next. Don't forget to subscribe if you want more moonlit love stories like this one.